She turned on the quiet street, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "Why are you following me?" she asked. I swallowed, my voice steady but soft. "Because you looked back." And in that fragile pause between us, the night suddenly felt charged with something neither of us expected. It was one of those evenings when the city seemed to breathe slower, as if the streets themselves had grown weary of the day. The lamps along the sidewalk cast long pools of amber light, leaving pockets of shadow in between. My footsteps were unhurried, my hands tucked into my jacket, the cool night air brushing against my face. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Nights like this usually just meant walking home, thinking about small things that would be forgotten by morning. But then I noticed her. She was a few paces ahead of me, her stride measured, confident, almost rhythmic. A soft scarf trailed behind her coat, fluttering when the wind caught it. There was something graceful in the way she carried herself, not hurried, not careless, but with a poise that made her stand out even on an empty street. I couldn't have explained why I paid attention at first. Maybe it was the simple elegance of her movement. Maybe it was the way her heels struck the pavement, each sound sharp but steady, like punctuation marks against the silence. For a moment, I told myself not to stare. She was just another stranger walking in the same direction. Yet there was something about her presence that pulled at me. And then it happened. She glanced back. It wasn't the casual look people give to check their surroundings. It lingered. Her eyes, dark, searching, found mine in the glow of the street lamp. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. In that second, the night shifted. It was no longer just me, walking down a familiar street. It was her, and me, and the silent thread that stretched across the few feet between us. I should have looked away. That would have been the polite thing, the ordinary thing. But I didn't. I held her gaze, not boldly, not challengingly, but with the quiet honesty of someone caught off guard. And when she finally turned forward again, I felt something stir inside me, a question, unformed but insistent. Why had she looked back? I kept walking, keeping my distance. I wasn't following her in the way the word usually implies. I wasn't chasing or intruding. It was more like I was answering a call I didn't fully understand. Every so often, the fabric of her coat caught the light, and I found myself noticing the details, the curve of her shoulders, the neat way she held herself, the calm but deliberate pace she kept. The street grew quieter as the shops behind us faded into darkened doorways. There were only the two of us now, walking the same path, the air between us filled with the subtle tension of awareness. I could almost hear my own thoughts echoing too loudly. Don't overthink this. It's nothing. Yet beneath that, another voice whispered, but what if it isn't? I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story. All I knew was that, in that single glance over her shoulder, she had acknowledged me, and once she had, something in me refused to let the night end like any other. She must have felt it, the presence of someone behind her, steady, unhurried, but close enough to notice. The sound of my footsteps matched hers, soft against the pavement. Maybe it was the way I hadn't drifted away down another street. Maybe it was instinct. Without warning, she stopped. The movement was sharp, decisive. Her coat swayed lightly as she turned to face me. Under the pale wash of the street lamp, her expression was guarded, brows gently knit, lips parted as though caught between suspicion and resolve. There was strength in her eyes, but also a question she seemed reluctant to ask. Her voice, when it came, was low yet steady, carrying the authority of someone who had learned to protect herself. "Why are you following me?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence around us. For a second I froze. My first instinct was to raise my hands, to insist that I wasn't, that it was just coincidence, two strangers sharing the same path. But her gaze demanded something different. She deserved honesty, not excuses. I felt the cool air tighten in my chest before I spoke. My voice came out softer than I expected, almost like a confession. "Because you looked back." There it was. The truth, simple and bare. Her expression shifted almost instantly. Surprise flickered across her face, breaking through the guarded mask she had put up. For a brief moment, the sharp edge in her stance softened. She tilted her head slightly, as though weighing the sincerity in my tone, the absurd simplicity of my answer. Her eyes lingered on mine, not cold, not dismissive, but questioning in a different way now. As if she wanted to understand what exactly I meant, and why it mattered. The night around us seemed to pause with her silence. The world had narrowed into this small circle of lamplight, her perfume carried faintly by the breeze, the faint warmth of our shared breath in the cool air. I could hear the distant hum of a car far down the road, the rustle of leaves overhead, but they felt far away, background noise to something much more immediate. I noticed her hand at her side curled loosely, the faintest tremor in her fingers betraying that she wasn't as unshakable as she wanted to appear. Confidence, yes, but layered over something quieter, more vulnerable. I didn't step closer. I didn't dare. Instead, I let the weight of my words rest between us, hoping she could feel that they weren't meant to alarm her, only to acknowledge the connection that had sparked with that single glance. Her lips pressed together, then curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but a recognition of something undeniable. Perhaps the honesty had disarmed her. Perhaps the absurdity of the moment had softened her caution. And just like that, the air shifted again. What had started as suspicion was now something else entirely, curiosity. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as she turned her face toward the dim stretch of street ahead. For a beat, she lingered in place, as though deciding whether to end the conversation here or allow it to continue. Then, with a small gesture of her hand, she began walking again. And without speaking, I fell into step beside her. We walked in silence at first. The sound of our footsteps filled the night, falling into a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, though either of us mentioned it. There was a kind of unspoken truce in the way she let me walk beside her now, as though my answer had earned me just enough trust to stay within her orbit. The city had grown hushed. Shops we passed were dark, their windows reflecting only the glow of street lamps. The air carried the faint scent of rain, though the sky above was clear. Every detail seemed sharper, more vivid, simply because she was here. She spoke first. Her voice had softened, though it still carried an edge of caution. "Do you usually talk to strangers like that?" I glanced at her, catching the way her eyes shifted toward me before darting forward again. "No," I admitted. "But then again, strangers don't usually look back at me." That earned me a small sound, not quite laughter, not quite dismissal. It was the kind of reaction someone gives when they don't want to admit they're amused. She shook her head lightly, her scarf brushing against her cheek as she did. "You're too young to be saying things like that." I smiled, though I didn't press. "Maybe. Or maybe I just mean them more." Her steps slowed a fraction, thoughtful. For the first time since she had turned to face me, I sensed her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. She was studying me, even if she didn't want to be obvious about it. The pavement narrowed as we approached a row of trees, their branches stretching overhead. For a moment, our arms brushed lightly as we walked, the faintest contact, but enough to spark awareness through my chest. She didn't pull away, though I felt the subtle shift of her breathing when it happened. "Where are you headed?" she asked finally. "Nowhere in particular," I said honestly. "Just walking." She gave me a sidelong glance, her lips pressing together. "You don't strike me as someone who does things without a reason." I chuckled softly. "Maybe tonight's the exception." Her eyes lingered on me a little longer this time before turning forward again. It was subtle, but I could see the battle playing out inside her, the instinct to guard herself and the quiet pull of curiosity she didn't seem ready to name. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt like its own kind of conversation, one where the pauses meant more than words. The steady rhythm of our footsteps, the brush of fabric, the occasional glance shared in the corner of our vision, all of it stitched together into something unspoken but undeniable. When the street curved, a light wind swept past, carrying the edge of her perfume toward me. It was warm, elegant, and it fit her in a way I couldn't quite put into words. I realized then how easily ordinary moments could shift when the right person was beside you. A walk, a glance, even silence, they all became charged, alive, fragile with possibility. And though we hadn't exchanged much, I knew with startling clarity, this night was no longer or we fell into step as though it had been arranged, though either of us said it aloud. The street stretched quiet and long ahead, dotted with lamps that carved out islands of amber light. Between them were shadows, soft and deep, where our figures moved side by side. I was aware of every sound, the muted scuff of my shoes, the clean click of her heels, the faint rustle of her coat whenever she shifted. For a while, silence carried us. It wasn't tense anymore, not exactly. It was cautious, curious, the kind of pause two people take when they aren't sure how much of themselves to reveal. She broke it first. Her voice, though calm, had a certain guarded texture to it. "Do you always say things like that?" I turned to look at her. The light caught strands of her hair, warm against the night. "Like what?" "Like, because you looked back." Her lips shaped the words slowly, as if replaying them for herself. I smiled faintly. "No. But it felt true. And it made you stop." Her eyes flicked toward me, quick, sharp, before she looked straight ahead again. The smallest shake of her head followed, but I caught the way her mouth softened, as though fighting the beginnings of a smile. "You're too young for lines like that," she murmured. I let the words settle between us. "Maybe. Or maybe I just mean them more." That earned a quiet breath of amusement from her. Not quite laughter, but not rejection either. The kind of sound people make when they don't want to admit they've been disarmed. The pavement narrowed as we reached a row of trees. Branches stretched overhead, filtering the lamplight into shifting patterns across her coat. Our arms brushed lightly, accidental, brief. But the warmth of the contact pulsed through me, and I thought I heard the faintest change in her breathing. She didn't pull away. "Where are you headed?" she asked, her voice steady again. "Nowhere special. Just walking." She gave me a sidelong glance, her eyes searching. "You don't strike me as someone who does things without a reason." I shrugged. "Maybe tonight is the reason." That made her pause and step, just slightly. I could feel her studying me even as she kept moving. Something in her was weighing whether I was reckless or sincere. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, of things unsaid, of questions she hadn't voiced, of answers I wasn't sure I had yet. The rhythm of our steps became its own conversation. A breeze slipped down the street, carrying the faint warmth of her perfume toward me. Elegant, subtle, it fit her perfectly. I breathed it in quietly, unwilling to break the fragile balance we had found. I realized then how even the simplest things, walking, silence, a brushed arm, could become electric in the presence of the right person. This was no longer just two strangers moving down the same street. It was something else, something delicate and unplanned, taking shape with every step we shared. The street eventually curved into a quieter stretch, lined with old plane trees that arched overhead like patient guardians. Their leaves whispered faintly in the breeze, scattering shadows across the pavement. Ahead, tucked just beneath one of the branches, sat a weathered wooden bench, the kind that had probably been there for years, softened by rain and time. She slowed when she saw it, her hand brushing lightly against the scarf at her neck as if considering something. Then, without a word, she moved toward the bench and lowered herself onto it. Her movements were careful, graceful. The way she smoothed her coat before sitting, the way her ankles crossed neatly as though the act of sitting itself carried a quiet dignity. I hesitated a step or two away. It felt like a choice, an invitation wrapped in silence. She didn't gesture for me to join her, but the tilt of her head, the way her eyes flicked up at me briefly before drifting away, carried its own kind of signal. So I sat. The wood beneath us creaked faintly, cool against the night. For a moment, we were just two figures beneath the branches, surrounded by lamplight and shadow. The bench wasn't wide, and though I left a respectful space, the nearness was unmistakable. I could feel the warmth of her presence, not touching, but close enough that if either of us leaned just slightly, the space between us would vanish. Neither of us spoke right away. The silence had shifted again, no longer cautious, no longer suspicious, but contemplative. I found myself listening to the small sounds around us, the rustle of leaves overhead, the faint hum of a distant car, the rhythm of her breathing beside me. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, fingers intertwined. I noticed how she adjusted them, as though keeping them still required effort. Every subtle movement seemed charged with something unspoken. Finally, she turned her head slightly toward me. Her eyes caught the lamplight, and for a heartbeat, I was struck by how much they revealed, not just confidence, but layers of history, of things felt and endured. "You don't seem afraid of silence," she said quietly. I shook my head. "Sometimes silence says more than words." A soft breath escaped her, almost like agreement. She leaned back slightly against the bench, her shoulder brushing the wood, and nearly brushing me. I could feel the faintest current of warmth where our sleeves hovered close, the almost touch sparking a restless awareness beneath my skin. For a while, we just sat there, letting the quiet stretch. It wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things we didn't know how to say yet: the weight of her glance when she thought I wasn't looking, the way I caught myself memorizing the curve of her profile in the light. The world outside the small circle of lamplight seemed distant, irrelevant. The night belonged to us, in this sliver of time carved out by a weathered bench and the shadows of trees. And as I sat there beside her, I knew this was no longer chance. This was the beginning of something neither of us had expected, but both of us, in some unspoken way, had chosen. The bench seemed to hold us in a small pocket of stillness, tucked away from the rest of the world. For a time, neither of us needed to speak. She gazed forward, her posture perfectly composed, though I sensed the weight of something she wasn't saying. Her hands remained folded in her lap, fingers twining and untwining as though trying to find their place. I noticed a subtle tremor in the motion, not nervousness exactly, but something deeper. A quiet struggle between keeping walls up and letting them slip. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a softness I hadn't heard before. "I don't usually talk like this to strangers." Her words lingered, fragile in the night air. She didn't look at me as she said them. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed ahead, watching the pattern of shadows on the pavement, as though they might give her courage. I let the silence stretch just long enough to respect the weight of her admission before answering. "Neither do I." That made her glance at me, brief but searching. There was something vulnerable in that look, a question she wasn't ready to put into words. "I suppose," she continued, her tone quieter now, "I've spent a long time keeping people at arm's length. It's easier that way. Safer." Her lips pressed together faintly, like she wasn't sure if she'd said too much. I studied her in that moment, the careful lines of her face, the steadiness she carried, and beneath it, the flicker of something unguarded. It was the kind of honesty people rarely allowed themselves, especially with someone they had just met. Without thinking too much, I moved slightly, just enough for my hand to rest lightly on hers. I didn't press, didn't grip, only let the warmth of my palm settle against her fingers. She stiffened for half a breath, instinctively protective. But then, slowly, I felt her hand ease beneath mine. Her fingers relaxed, not clinging but not pulling away either. The contact was simple, yet it carried more than words could. Her skin was cool from the night air, but there was warmth beneath, steadying and real. I felt the faint tremor quiet as her shoulders softened by degrees, as though some unspoken burden had shifted ever so slightly. "I don't think safer always means better," I said quietly. Her head turned toward me then, and for the first time, she held my gaze without looking away. There was a sheen of hesitation in her eyes, but also a glimmer of relief, the recognition that her honesty hadn't pushed me away, but pulled me closer. She drew in a breath, slow and deep, as if testing the air between us. "You're very certain for someone your age." I smiled gently. "Maybe certainty is easier when you have nothing to lose by being honest." That made her pause, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't resistance either. It was the look of someone who hadn't expected comfort but found it anyway. And as our hands rested together on the quiet bench, I realized that what mattered most wasn't the words we spoke, but the simple choice she made, to let me hold even a small part of her vulnerability without pulling away. The night had grown quieter still, as if the city itself had given us permission to linger in our silence. The air carried a cool edge, but the warmth of her hand beneath mine seemed to anchor me, a steady reminder that this moment was real, fragile, and alive. She hadn't pulled away, and that felt significant. Every minute that passed, her guard seemed to soften just a little more. Her fingers shifted lightly against mine, not to escape but as though adjusting to the unfamiliar comfort. Her voice, when it came again, was low and thoughtful. "It's strange. I don't even know your name, and yet—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if unsure whether to finish the thought. I waited. The pause itself was telling, the hesitation of someone torn between caution and honesty. "And yet what?" I asked gently. Her lips parted, but instead of answering, she gave a small, almost self-conscious laugh. "Never mind. It sounds foolish." I leaned in slightly, just enough that I could hear her breath, feel the faint brush of warmth as it reached me. "Try me." That caught her. She turned her face toward me, and suddenly the space between us felt impossibly small. Her hair shifted with the movement, brushing softly against my sleeve. The faint perfume she wore was stronger now, a delicate warmth that wrapped around me as though the night itself had drawn us closer. Her eyes met mine, steady and searching, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to that single connection. I could feel the pull, the quiet, undeniable urge to bridge the last inch of distance between us. I thought she might close it herself. Her gaze dropped briefly to my lips before lifting again, and I felt my pulse quicken at the silent admission. But she didn't move. Neither did I. Instead, we sat suspended in that fragile tension, both of us holding back not because we didn't want to, but because the wanting itself was already too much. I smiled faintly, breaking the intensity without breaking the connection. "You don't have to say it if you don't want to." Her chest rose with a slow breath, and when she exhaled, it sounded like relief and frustration tangled together. "You're infuriatingly patient," she murmured. I let out a soft chuckle. "Maybe I just know some things are worth waiting for." That earned me a look, one that carried both exasperation and something softer, more vulnerable. She shook her head, but the motion was gentle, her lips curving into the faintest smile. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, alive, filled with everything we hadn't said but had already felt. My hand remained over hers, her shoulder brushing mine ever so slightly when she leaned back again. And though the moment of near confession passed without words, I knew something had shifted. The space between us would never be the same again, because now it carried the weight of almost. The night had stretched itself thin, the street lamps humming softly as though they were the only witnesses left. We remained on that weathered bench beneath the tree, wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's company. I didn't know how long we had been sitting there. Time felt unmoored, suspended in the silence between us. Eventually, though, she shifted. It was subtle, just the slight straightening of her back, the quiet exhale of someone who knows the moment must give way to reality. Her fingers slipped lightly beneath mine, not pulling away entirely but moving just enough to remind me that all evenings, no matter how rare, must end. She stood slowly, smoothing her coat with the same graceful care I had noticed when she first sat. I rose with her, almost without thinking, not ready to let the night close in so quickly. For a heartbeat, we stood close. The lamplight pulled at our feet, her shadow overlapping mine. She glanced up at me, and in that look was everything we hadn't dared to say: curiosity, hesitation, and the faint but undeniable spark of something neither of us had planned for. Her hand lifted, almost tentative, and came to rest lightly on my arm. The touch was brief at first, but then her fingers lingered, pressing just enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin through the fabric. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it carried more meaning than words could. "Maybe," her voice trailed off, delicate and uncertain. Then she tried again, her eyes steady on mine. "Maybe we'll see each other again." The way she said it wasn't casual. It wasn't the empty politeness people use when they part from strangers. It carried weight, the acknowledgement that something had begun here, something she wasn't ready to dismiss. I smiled, not too broadly, just enough for her to see that I understood. I'd like that. For a moment, neither of us moved. She seemed to weigh something in her mind, then leaned forward just enough for her cheek to brush mine. The warmth of her skin against me lasted only a breath, but the softness of it, the quiet intimacy, settled into me like a memory already etched deep. When she pulled back, her smile was small but real, touched with both courage and vulnerability. She adjusted her scarf, gathered herself, and began to walk slowly away. I didn't follow this time. I watched instead, the click of her heels steady and measured as she moved down the quiet street. Each step felt like a thread pulling taut between us, stretching but not breaking. Even when she disappeared beyond the curve of the trees, I could still feel the echo of her hand on my arm, the warmth of her cheek against mine, the steady rhythm of her presence beside me. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that this night would not fade into ordinary memory. It would stay, a quiet turning point etched into the kind of silence where everything truly begins. 10.